Thank you all for joining us. My name is Nathan Spencer. I'm Executive Director with WakeUP Wake County. I am here joining me with Tom Barrie. Tom, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and tell us your expertise and your work.
Yes, so thank you, Nathan. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm especially interested in participating in your efforts here because for most of my teaching career, over 30 years, I've been involved in housing research and education. I'm a professor of architecture at the College of Design at NC State, where I lead the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Initiative.
Very cool. Starting with like a very wide question on, I asked you here to talk a little bit about the missing middle ordinance that Raleigh City Council has recently changed with our text change. With that, since they passed that, what is missing middle exactly?
Okay, so it's interesting we call it the missing middle, right? You wouldn't have something missing unless you already had it at one point. And as it turns out, US cities had much more of a diverse housing stock than we do now. And the reason for that is that, of course, we replace our housing stock quite regularly. And what's happened is that zoning regulations, zoning ordinances have over the years, but particularly beginning in the post-World War II era, have generally favored what we call exclusive zoning and then focus on the single family house. Now, how do we know that we used to build differently? You just have to walk around Raleigh. If you go to our older, right, inner ring residential neighborhoods like Oakland, Mordecai, Boylan Heights, etc., Cameron Park, you will see a mix of housing types. And from small apartment buildings to carriage apartments and so forth. I live in the Mordecai neighborhood of Raleigh, right next to Oakwood, actually. And next door to our single family house is what I like to call a mansion apartment. It's a quad, right? And a quad is one of the missing middle types of housing. It has 4 units in it, but it looks like a large house. And so it fits in with the neighborhood, I would say, seamlessly, from my opinion. So missing middle is housing types that are between single family on a, usually a mid to large size lot, and multi-family, which are, typically apartment buildings or condos that have quite a few units in them. Duplexes, right? 2-unit housing, triplexes, 3, quads like the one next door. Townhomes is another missing middle. Courtyard apartments is another one you see in Chicago residential neighborhoods, a lot of courtyard apartments, which are actually beautiful, live, work, etc. They're basically housing options that fill the gap between single family and multifamily.
Perfect. And so if I'm a homeowner, how is this going to affect me?
Very little. And the reason is that like the accessory dwelling unit ordinance, which, as we know, took a fair amount of debate until it was finally passed in 2020. Like that ordinance, this is what we call gentle density. In other words, our neighborhoods build out and get a little bit more dense over time. this is no government program. This depends on the market, which is how most of our housing is built. All built, built according to market forces. So for missing middle housing to be built in these in the areas of Raleigh, the zoning districts where this ordinance now allows them to be built, is going to be a modest and incremental process. You hear regularly, we heard this with ADUs, there's going to be more traffic, more congestion, our sewers are going to be overloaded and so forth. And just so you know, that's not just Raleigh. These are the kind of fears that get voiced around the country. Research indicates that those fears are, for the most part, or I would say mostly, unfounded.
Awesome. Well, so as I guess on the opposite end, if I'm a renter, how will this affect me as well?
Well, it's hard to speak really for either homeowners or renters because everybody's different and everybody has their, their own perspectives based on where they live and how long they've lived there and so forth. But what I would say is that missing middle, and there's a fair amount of research out there, missing middle housing, which tends to be smaller units. You don't have a lot of yard, if any, to take care of. Maintenance, like in a condo, association, in a condominium, right? Maintenance is handled through, the condo association and so forth, right? So these are less labor-intensive houses, right? As opposed to the single family house that I live in, where we mow the lawn, we tend the gardens. If the roof leaks, we have to find the roofer and fix it and so forth, right? So it is serving a, what we call, really the changed demographics in our country, right? So the post-World War era, really the demographics were dominated by either national perceptions of or the reality of the married couple with children, right? And there's different data out there on that. What we do know now is that only about 20% of Americans actually live in what we call a traditional family. Married couple with children. That leaves a lot of people who don't need housing to, serve those needs of raising a family and so forth, right? We have two-income families, in fact, growing numbers for many reasons of two-income families. That also has an impact on how much you want to invest in your time, right, in your housing. And then we have all of the generations, right? You don't need me to note them, from millennials on, where research indicates they're increasingly disinterested in home ownership, or if they're going to own a home, in owning a single family house. Much more interested in living in denser, connected communities that are close to commercial and recreational and civic organizations, right? They want to more be, citizens of the city and participate in the city, less so much wanting to buy a refuge from the city.
That makes a whole lot of sense, and I totally get that. Especially as a transplant to North Carolina, you talked about demographics of who these sort of residents might be, but tell me a little bit more about who these missing middle residents are.
They're your neighbors.
I like that. Okay.
That's who they are. Okay, so I have this unit next door. It's this quad next door, And first of all, the folks who have lived there, I've known just about everybody who's ever lived there. We've lived in our house now for almost 20 years. And currently we have a student who's living there with her partner boyfriend. We have a single woman who's self-employed who lives there and whom I'm always talking to because she walks her dog a lot. We have somebody who's worked in a local restaurant. Right? The restaurant is just down the street, and she's worked there for as long as we've lived here. She's lived in our neighborhood longer than we have. And then somebody who works in a corporate job. We not only know our neighbors, but we know all their pets, right? Because their cats in particular all come over and socialize with our cats, right? So you get the picture. These aren't kind of anonymous renters. They're our neighbors. They're people that if we take the time and care, we get to know them. We get to know their pets, and they're just part of where we live. That's
really interesting. So it's not really like we're not talking about one type of person. We're really talking about a great cross section of our community.
That's right. And then if you just look at this example, I mean, these are fairly small units. And so I never remember having a family living there, like a couple with children. They're just not made for that. There's not enough space. For all of us who have raised kids, well, yes, you do need a little bit of space. And that makes sense. So it's serving folks who's, maybe their kids have grown up. Maybe they've gotten divorced or separated. Maybe they've never married or had children, a student who isn't married and so forth. 80% of our population fits within those and other categories, and they need housing to serve their needs. That's the most important thing. It's the missing middle is filling the middle with housing choices, but it's also filling the unrecognized needs of 80% of our population.
That's amazing. I didn't realize it was so large. Now, there's a lot of, as you'd mentioned, sort of the concerns that gets passed around in a lot of cities. What does this mean for development in Raleigh?
So I suspect, like the accessory dwelling unit, which was citywide by right, and in some ways the ADU ordinance, I would say, is more ambitious than this text change. So I would, and in terms of the ADU ordinance, we've actually have not seen. And for those of us who advocated for them, it's a little disappointing. The fairly low figures of people applying to build, for permits to build ADUs, and also ones that have been built. It's too early to have accurate metrics. That's why I'm not giving you numbers. But the impact is at this point is just simply not noticeable. I imagine that this change in the Unified Development Ordinance, so everybody should know this is a change. That's why it's called a text change. They're actually changing and augmenting the text of the 2013 Unified Development Ordinance, in other words, the UDO, which of course it was first approved in 2013, but is constantly being updated. This is just one of many updates to it. So that's the first thing. The second thing, it does not include R1 districts, which are exclusive single-family zoning districts. What it includes are the other residential districts in addition to that. Now, in terms of land use, the amount of land that is dedicated to the different zoning districts It is fairly significant. About 60% of the land in Raleigh is zoned R2 to R10. These are residential districts, but it does make up a significant amount of the land use in Raleigh. But like I said, all this is market driven. And so, like any market-driven development, it's going to take place over time, and so I actually hope that it is, more, more effective than and has more impact than I think it will. But at best, it will be modest, incremental development over time.
Okay, so what I gather from this is that Raleigh City Council didn't outlaw single-family homes.
No, let's just say it. It did not outlaw single-family houses. And by the way, that has been a rallying cry across the country, because across the country, in fact, Raleigh is kind of catching up. Other cities and even states have been way ahead of us in terms of, what we call land use reform. And what these changes to zoning ordinances or unified development ordinances do is that they permit other housing types to be built in what previously had been exclusively limited to single-family houses. You can still build single-family houses there. If you have a single-family house there, it's not going to affect it. But like in my neighborhood of Mordecai, there's a chance that instead of that single-family house next door, you might have a mansion apartment, a quad like I have next door. So it does not affect, single family houses. Now, I just want to mention some states and cities have gone much further. The state of Oregon, a few years ago, I can't remember the exact date, they actually changed exclusive single family zoning to include other housing types statewide. In every mid-size and larger cities, you do not find zoning that says you can only build large lot single family houses here. There's been a lot of press around the Minneapolis 2040 plan, which does the same thing. Simply within the city of Minneapolis allows duplexes, triplexes, and so forth in zones that were previously excluded those housing types.
Got it. So how does this and I know this is really your focus of study, how does this affect and address the housing affordability and the housing crisis?
I wish I could say it was going to make a big difference, but I think at best it's going to have a modest impact. Again, it's going to depend on market-driven development, and will be incremental. We have, the way we build housing in this country is almost predominantly market-driven, and in particular, a belief in is what gets called the wisdom of the free market. That the free market will adjust. The free market will fill in those missing areas because that's what free markets do best, unregulated markets. I'm sorry to say that if we had a wise free market system, we wouldn't have an affordable housing crisis at the moment. And the way most countries, and in the past, this country has solved or certainly mitigated housing crises is for government, in other words, our shared resources, to participate in that. Unfortunately, in North Carolina, we have just the opposite. We do not have our federal government involved, our state government involved significantly in addressing our housing crisis, particularly our affordable housing crisis. And in that we also have laws that further inhibit it. North Carolina it's illegal for any municipality to have what we call inclusionary zoning. And inclusionary zoning requires that developments of a certain size, right, so many units or so forth, include a certain percentage of units that are reserved for affordable rents. That's and you find that in other states in the country. We cannot do that. So what I would say, so that there's little in terms of ways in this state and others, mind you, to guide market-driven housing to address the affordable housing crisis. You see what I mean? All we have is the market, and in regulatory changes like this text change to allow the market to be able to build more diverse housing. Some of it will happen because there is a demand for it, like I mentioned before. But there's no guarantee that it's going to be affordable. It will provide diverse and more diverse housing stock for our changed demographics, but there's no guarantee that it is going to be affordable. And most likely in many of our neighborhoods, which are already unaffordable, the units that will be built will not be affordable also. They do tend to notch down the price point simply in terms of cost per square foot, because they're smaller units, you're not buying so much land, and so forth. That's what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, NOAHs. And an undependable method, but it is part of what ADUs are naturally occurring affordable too. In other words, it's affordable housing that is not built or managed by the federal government, by state governments, by nonprofit housing developers. It is owned and operated by you and me, right, for our own reasons. What I would say is that this text change is a very welcome and timely, modest first step in land use reform. It is just beginning the process of reforming what we call exclusive zoning policies. So if I may just take a moment to underline that defending exclusive zoning, if you're doing that, you should familiarize yourself with the history of exclusive zoning. In particular, it's not limited to this country, of course, but in particular to this country. Now, exclusive zoning at first made sense. In other words, it's zoning that excludes certain uses. Now, when we had a largely industrialized country, that made a lot of sense. As is often cited, you do not want the glue factory next to your house. So we said, okay, so the glue factories go out here and our housing goes over here. That works, right? Now, of course, we live in a very different country here. And what increasingly happened with exclusive zoning, and this starts to happen early in the 20th century, and then picks up a lot of momentum in the post-World War II era, is that exclusive zoning, in other words, now we're not only excluding industry, but we're excluding certain housing types, right? You can only build single family here. All the apartments need to go over here, and so forth. So it is, again, an exclusive zoning that is exclusionary. Certain housing can't go there. So what we find, particularly now following the Fair Housing Act in the mid 1960s. And this is always at the local level. The federal government stepped in and said, with the Fair Housing Act, there shall be no discrimination in housing based on race. Local municipalities found a very effective way to get around that, and a legal one. They changed their zoning. They made it more and more restrictive, more and more exclusive. So that what we have now is what gets called economic zoning. So, right, Fair Housing Act is still in force. You cannot, deny somebody housing based on your race. But we legally can deny people housing based on their wealth status or their income. And so what happens is that a whole segment of our population, of our neighbors in our city of Raleigh, cannot live in a lot of areas of Raleigh because there's no housing diversity there. The only thing that they can buy are the more expensive single-family housing on large lots. And so they cannot buy into the services, schools, etc., of these areas. The parts that make these areas so attractive. And because of the history of racist housing policies and their relationship to generational wealth building. And I direct you to a book such as Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, if you're interested in a very rigorous study on this, is that for generations, African Americans have been unable to build wealth because of discriminatory housing policies. And so the economic exclusionary zoning too often translates into racially exclusionary zoning. And we just have to own up to that and recognize that even though you and I and others didn't design it in that way, our market-driven, exclusionary zoned settlement patterns, that's what's happening. Mm-hmm. We might not have been, particularly, maybe now, designed to do that. Originally, some specifically were, but that's what the outcome is. And so even modest land use reform that Raleigh has started is a step in the right direction.
That's really interesting. So this can be not just an affordable factor, but also taking apart some of the classist and racist mechanisms that are built into our current zoning process. That's incredible.
Yep.
Wow.
The text change doesn't say that, but it at least, I hope, gets us to think about and maybe talk about our housing policies and their impacts in an informed and dispassionate way.
Well, so with that said, you've mentioned sort of limitations, and you've mentioned sort of where, areas that we should be thinking about our housing. What more needs to be done with this?
You want A to M first or N to Z? But let's just keep it local, and I'll keep it short. Okay. Right? We need national housing reform, just like I've illustrated in one case here. The federal government has effectively gotten out of the business of affordable housing, and the programs that use federal money are state-based. And there's two, basically. There's a low-income housing tax credit program, which is a way to help housing developers, nonprofit, for-profit, to kind of make the numbers of their housing developments, right? They're tax credits, right? They are a way of generating the type of income to make a project viable. And those are governed by, in North Carolina, we have the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, and they have something called a QAP. And the QAP are the rules for what you can build and how you can build it, etc. If you're going to use what we call LIHTC. And all of these restrictions need to be addressed when you apply for LIHTC funding for your project. And it is very easy to be eliminated, and in part because there's very limited funds. We hear talk with the Biden administration of raising funding for LIHTCs, and I think we're going to see some improvement there. But much more needs to be done. So we need reform just in our state too. We need to really look. I mean, it seems like inclusionary zoning is a bit of a third rail in this state, but that doesn't mean it should be off the table. So the other federal program, by the way, are Section 8 or housing choice vouchers, and that is a way of subsidizing rental payments. So if I qualified based on my income, right? If I qualified for a housing choice voucher, based on my income, I would get a certain amount of money that I could use to apply towards my monthly rent. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't pay your rent. It simply subsidizes your rent. And it's all subject to the market. You have to find a unit on your own, and you have to have your rental agreement approved by your landlord. And there are, in North Carolina, there are no laws that prevent a landlord from denying a Section 8 applicant. And furthermore, North Carolina does not allow for the tracking of rental units. Right, so we have very little data out there in terms of units owned by landlords and so forth that would help us to start to see patterns in rentals, and rentals are a very important part of the housing picture. We've gotten quite obsessed in this country about home ownership, and there's a lot of good reasons for that, but it doesn't work for everybody. And it increasingly doesn't work for an increasingly mobile culture. Most people move about every 5 years. And trying to move when you own a big house is a lot more work than letting your lease run out. And what you don't build is with rentals is equity over time, and what you can't do is write off your rental payments on your federal income tax, the way the mortgage interest deduction option works for home ownership in this country. In other words, if you own a house, you get to deduct from your federal income tax the interest that you paid on your mortgage, or a percentage of it. It is the largest public housing program we run in this country. Unfortunately, it mostly serves middle to upper class and economic class citizens. So, So we need to really look at rentals and the subsidies of rentals, and we need a lot more. We actually hate to use that word, regulatory mechanisms, but we do. We need regulations where the free market, where economic markets simply do not have the capacity to regulate themselves. All right, and then lastly, and this is where I could have started, and I could still be talking about it. We need to build a sustainable future. We need our cities to become sustainable cities. And some of the greenest cities, some of the greenest places in this country are dense cities. There's a lot of reasons for that, but here's just one simple example. If you build a duplex shares a demising wall. That is one less wall that is exposed to the exterior. So when it's 95 degrees in August, it's one less wall that is letting that heat beat through your walls.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting.
Same thing in cold climates where your heat is radiating out of what we call your building envelope. Apartments, quads, and so forth realize even more in terms of energy usage because of shared walls. Manhattan is one of the greenest places in the world. It also happens to be a very dense city. We also need transit-served, walkable communities. Because if you can walk to services, if you can bike to the store, which I do in my neighborhood, then you're not going to be driving how many trips per day just to take care of the things that we all need to take care of each day. And of course, emissions from automobiles are a significant contributor to the emissions of what we call greenhouse gases. But when it comes to zoning and settlement patterns, everybody should know that 40% of emissions of greenhouse gases or associated with those emissions are directly related to buildings, to the built environment, 40%. Wow. So changing how we build, right? High energy heating and cooling systems and so forth, but settlement patterns are really part of that as well. Transportation contributes 20%. So wow. You put those together, settlement patterns and how we build are absolutely key to solving our climate crisis. And so sustainability is kind of the beginning and end of why zoning reform is a good idea and good for everybody.
That's amazing. That's wonderful. And we'll definitely be talking more and more about that as we talk about climate and its effect on land use patterns and how we need to adjust it. So that's wonderful, and we'll have you back on that. Tom, thank you so much for joining us for this video, and we really appreciate it. We hope that those watching will get a lot out of this and understand a little bit more about that text change from Raleigh, and will continue to stay with us and learn more. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.